community, and welcome back to another Keeping It Real conversation with Dr. Anita. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, founder and president of Dr. Anita Enterprises. And as a C-suite trusted advisor, I help leaders and teams reframe diversity conversations from being difficult to being different. Today, we're finishing our conversation with Ms. Deepa Purushothaman. She is co-founder of Information and author of the book, The First, the Few, and the Only, which we're going to be getting into right now. Welcome back, Deepa. I'm so excited to have you back.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So this is your first book. Last time we ended with the article of talking about the delusion inclusion, or the inclusion delusion that Black women often face when we're moving on up the ladder, not quite sure what's going on and why we don't have the power that is perceived to be there. In this book, you talk about three big ideas: the first, the few, and the only. The first is that corporate America is not a meritocracy. The second is we are all innately powerful, and we find our power as individuals and collectively. And the third big idea is that anything that has come before can be undone and redone. Let's unpack that first big idea. Corporate America is not a meritocracy. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was really important for me to just say that out loud. And I think more of us are saying that. But when I said it, or when I started to write it 2 years ago, it felt very scary to say. Especially, you're right, since it was my first book. And what I was trying to make people understand, I think this is really important for your leaders, is that the workplace shows up differently for different people. And it doesn't have to be a scary statement. I'm not trying to, throw stones at anybody. I'm just trying to say it does show up differently for us. And we need to talk about that. We need to make space to talk about that. And so
I'm going to ask you if I can interrupt you right there, because I think that's something that we need to look at right there. Just because we're sharing our experience doesn't mean that it's a threat to you and your experience. Correct. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I think that's why I liked how you describe your work. I think so often this work can be all about all the things a leader has done wrong. It can be all about, especially white men sitting in the seats, like you need to abdicate your seat. And that's not really how I come at this. Mm-hmm. I want us to learn. I want us to move forward. I want us to make space so that I can lead in the way that I want to lead and that I need to lead. But I'm not saying you have to necessarily change how you lead. I just want you to be open to the fact that we lead differently. And I may need you to change some of how you look at me and how you make space for me, and understand that my experience is really different. And I don't know, just as a human being, I don't know why that has to be difficult. Early in the book, I talk about delusions. I talk about 10 delusions that really, I think, define corporate America. These are things that we have been told about how the workplace is that I just think are flawed thinking. And one of the biggest things I talk about is that we need to really change this idea that power is about taking it from a certain group and giving it to another. Because I think there is a moment right now where inclusion work is seen as taking power away from white men. And that's not what I focus on. I really focus on how do we help women of color find their voice, find their power, which again, I think is going to be different in a lot of cases than white men. But it's about realizing that the seats at the table can expand. And it's not about just taking a seat and giving it to another person. But that's how we've been taught capitalism work. That's how we've been taught corporate America works. And so that's a little bit of what I think is broken. Doesn't answer your question about meritocracy, but I think it's an important point, and I think that's really where we have to come from, that this work is about making space for everybody. It's not about taking and making people leave the table in an aggressive sort of way. As far as the meritocracy, I opened the book talking about a story that I had, or a conversation I had with Renee Meyer. She is the VP of Inclusion at Netflix. And when I asked her about inclusion, she started talking about airplane design. And she said when she was a young mom, when her kids were little, she used to really struggle when she traveled on the airplane, because she used to worry that, the overhead luggage would fall on her kids' heads. And she used to sit there the entire flight thinking, like, why was it designed that way? And I jumped in because as a former partner, I used to fly 3 times a week. 6 times, like literally 3 cities a week, right. 6 times a week. I was getting my suitcase up and putting it down, and I'm 5'1". And so my process of getting my suitcase overhead, especially if I've packed for a week or two, is difficult. And so just in that 5-minute conversation, we were sharing like our experience of being in, because Renee is tall, is very different in this really small space. And I use it in the book because it's a great example of how a small space can show up differently for 2 different women of color. But then take a 5'10", gentleman sitting next to me. And I share this story all the time. And so many men will say to me, I've never even thought about that, So again, the space showing up differently for different people. And I think it's also a really important story because I worry about the suitcase, getting it up 15 minutes before I get on the plane, and I worry about it 15 minutes before the plane is landing. Like, it's an hour-long process for me. And so the same is true for workplaces. Like, we not only have to fit into spaces that weren't always created for us, but the worrying about it is also something we don't talk about enough, right? The need to fit in and what that does to us, and the mental trauma is also something we don't talk about enough. And so that's really what I'm describing for people. I'm trying to get people to understand that airplane analogy, because people, once I describe it, are like, yeah, that makes sense. I never even thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
That's true for workplaces. When you ask me to behave a certain way, if that's not my normal way, if that's not how I think, or, if English is not even my first language, that is a translation that happens that we need to understand and talk about. I'm not asking you to change everything. I'm just asking you to be aware. And then maybe we can talk about what needs to change to make it more, open for more people.
That is a wonderful analogy. And my mind is just going to so many different places right now. When we think in particular about diversity, too often we think just about the obvious, what you see, how you show up, how you choose to identify. But there's also the beauty in diversity of thought, diversity of background. In particular, I like to think of the fact that we all possess some kind of privilege. We all do. We have to maybe sit down and think about it sometimes. But if nothing else, we all possess the common privilege of having been hurt to the point of we never want to be the catalyst or the cause of similar hurt to someone else. And so sometimes we find privilege in our pain. And I think that's a pretty powerful thing. So to your point about, we're not trying to take anyone else's seat at the table. We're just trying to make the table bigger so that we all can fit around it. We all bring something valuable. There's something that we can all benefit from. There's something that we can all offer. And when we think about how someone else shows up and why they show up the way they do, if we can get an appreciation around that, then we can have an even greater appreciation for what they do bring to the table. The fact that you are the height that you are, and that these overhead bins are so much taller than you are, that gives us an appreciation for how you approach problem solving and how you still manage to travel by yourself and get where you need to go. We don't think about these things in the way that we should. We too often see, well, do we really want to bring this person along because of whatever differential we prove in our minds to exist?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think what for me, what I was trying to really get across is that, the idea of meritocracy, I think, suggests that those differences don't show up for people. And that's the disconnect. That's the error. I'm not saying, let's reward people who maybe don't have a certain skill set that's really important to do a critical job. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about lowering the bar, which is sometimes what people think when you talk about meritocracy. I'm just saying there's not acknowledgement that, the situation and our experiences and who we are fundamentally different. So how we see the workplace, how we see experiences, how we interpret data, how we talk, all that is really different for different people. And we need to really have that conversation, then decide what to do about it. And until now, there hasn't even been space to have that conversation.
And I think it's because the challenge is when we see what we perceive as a drawback or whatever word that we want to use, it's not an opportunity to say, how can we learn from this and how can we all benefit? Too often it's seen as, well, let's put this person aside for whatever reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of what I try to focus on is the fact that women of color in particular have really unique lived experiences, right? The things that we grew up to think, to make us first, fews, and onlys, we've had to navigate a lot. Not all of that has been easy. And yet we have these really the rich tapestry, and we come from all these different places. And yet there's not space for those kinds of qualities or that sort of history in the workplace. And we need to make space for that as well. So to your point, like, these things can be innovative. These things can be new. These things can actually expand the conversation. But again, we tend to be very narrow in how we see good workers and how we see the prized worker and how we reward success. And part of what I think we're missing is really what women of color could truly bring to the table and how they could transform and really innovate and grow businesses if they had the space to do so.
A word that's been trending, especially since the Great Resignation, is resiliency. And I think that's something that we offer in abundance.
Yes.
How do we become resilient?
Yes. I have a challenge with the word sometimes, because I think that there's a default, especially for Black women, of like, you're just resilient. So great. And I think that that's a lot of what the First, the Few, the Only is about. Although it's about not just Black women, it's about women of color. A lot of what I'm talking about is we don't talk about the shadow side of trailblazing.
Absolutely.
There is negatives. there are a lot of scars from that struggle. And I want us to be proud of them or to talk about them, but we also need to change it. Like part of the problem that I have is I think we uphold these few that have trailblazed, and we don't ask, well, why aren't there more, right? We just kind of focus on how great these few exceptional women are. And yes, they're exceptional, but how much have they had to swallow in order to get there? And that's not what I want the rest of the women coming up to do. We need to change that behavior.
That's right. That's right. And while they're exceptional, there are plenty more that are out there that just are not visible.
Correct.
Yeah. So the second big idea from your book, we are all innately powerful, and we find our power as individuals and collectively. Tell us about that.
So in the book, I talk about the power of me and the power of we. And so it's this idea that, again, for a lot of us, we've been told by our parents or by our cultures or by our society, by our communities, what power is, and also what success looks like. And for a lot of the women that I work with, they have to rewrite those messages for themselves. I call it shedding and carrying. You have to shed messages that don't serve you and find new ones that do. And part of what I'm trying to get at is for a lot of us as women, and I think, by the way, this is now true in the moment that we're in, not just for women of color, but for women, we're chasing success that isn't really going to work for us. And it's going to burn us out. It's not made for us. It doesn't work in the other roles that we want to play in our lives. And so I'm asking us to stand still, to really question what you've been taught, and to really ask, like, who do you want to be? How do you want to show up? How do you want to lead? And to do the work. There's a whole ton of work that we're not going to get into on this call, on this podcast, but that's really the work of me, that I have to figure out for myself. What do I believe? How do I want to show up? And then in order to make change, we need to find the power of we. We need to find our sisters. We need to find collective, because you can't make change in a company or in society by yourself. And you also need to tell stories. That's why those dinners that I talked about in the last episode were so important, because that's how we built fortitude amongst ourselves. So that me and that we are really important. And I think they're really important right now, because so many of the women that I work with are exhausted and traumatized, and we're just in a moment where we're depleted. And when I ask women, like, where do you find your energy? Most of them are saying from other women. It's interesting. Like, we're in a moment where I think the collective is also depleted, and I don't know how we re-energize ourselves as a collective. But there is something about gathering that also fulfills us, right? That kind of brings us back when we need some of that replenishment. And so it's both of those pieces that we need if we're going to succeed.
When you talk about gathering, some things that I found in my research were the 3 practices of thriving communities: the practice of the table, the practice of the commons, and the practice of the hearth. And the practice of the table I find really nourishing on several different levels. It's not just gathering around food, it's the stories that are brought to the table about the food. This recipe has been in my family for years, or these cookies remind me of when my mother and my grandmother and I would get together at Christmas. Whatever the stories are, and that's what helps build community. So when you talked about having these dinners and connecting with these women, that's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I talk a little bit about that, like how culturally, a lot of us come from cultures where we gathered in different ways. We gathered to share medicine. We gathered to, share food for the community. We, gathered to create safety, right? And so there's a lot around gathering that is true to the cultures that we come from that we also don't talk about enough. Part of what, again, it's hard to go through the whole book, but a lot of what I'm trying to highlight is that I think as women of color, we get a lot of, indirect messages that we're not enough, that we're not pretty enough, not good enough, not smart enough, not leaders enough. And that starts really early. Just this week, based on when this airs, but there was the whole Sesame Place, incident where there's 2 Black girls who were kind of shunned by one of the, I don't know what the right word is, but one of the large puppets that was walking by. And, it's an example where if that is not undone, like, little girls are going to feel, right? Like, I'm not good enough to shake, I think her name is Rosita's hand, right? Like, whatever that is. But those kinds of messages happen so often and so early and get so ingrained. And so part of what I'm trying to help us realize is we have to let go of those messages and remember where we do come from, where we do get energy, because that power comes from inside us. That power is not going to come externally, because most often those messages we get externally are actually not helpful to us. And so that's really what the second sort of message of the book is, that you have to figure out who you are, because power, can't be taken from you if you know who you are and where that comes from. And it comes from inside, not outside.
That's right. And multiple microaggressions can have a major impact on us. And it does start when we're young. The third big idea from the book is anything that has come before can be undone and redone. What's that about?
Yeah, so a lot of the book is about power. And I met with women and women of color, in droves at this point. And it's interesting when I use the word power, a lot of us cower away from that word. We see it as negative. We see it as competitive. We see it as exploitative. It's not something that a lot of women aspire to if you actually do surveys and look at the research. And so part of what I'm trying to help us understand is, one, we can remake power and how we think about power, but we also can remake structures. I think there's a feeling, and we're in a really special moment where I think this is changing. We're in a moment where I think a lot of us have been told structures can't change, right? Capitalism can't change. Like the justice system is too big and too broken to change, like all these things. But I believe we're in a moment where change is possible. We have to come together to make change. And so in the book, I tell a story where I met with a lobbyist, and she said to me, have you ever watched a movie where they say, the king is dead, long live the king? And it's one sentence, it's one continuous sentence almost. And she was basically saying to me that we, the people, give power. Like we're literally saying one person is dead, and here's the institution that we're giving, the new king that we're giving power to. And that we as people really in society are what gives structures power. It's not that the structures are there to give us power. And so I think a different way of realizing that we can make change. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying, it's not going to require sacrifice and hard work, but it's this idea that you don't have to accept anything around you. I'm not saying that there's an easy way to fix it, but I want us to not accept what's around us in a lot of cases because it's broken. It's been flawed from how it was created, and it's time to remake those structures so they work for more of us. And so that's really what that principle is about.
Where do you get your enthusiasm and this belief that things that have been in existence for literally decades can really change?
I think because we have to. Yeah. I just, they're too broken for them to keep going. I also just think we're facing COVID, to be honest with you. It was an interesting place to be writing a book like this. COVID was in a lot of ways, a depressing time for a lot of people, but I think it showed us new ways of being, new priorities, new ways of working. If you look at all the positive environmental impacts, like we're in a moment where, the world, the planet, needs us to act differently. And I don't know, I'm not, it's a little woo. I'm not saying that COVID happened as a result of that, but it's almost awakened us to a different set of, questions, a different set of operating norms. And so that's a little bit of what gives me hope is that, everyone's been awakened. When I started writing this book, it didn't feel like anyone was awakened. And I thought I was going to have to honestly explain things like, what is inclusion? Like, what is this? I thought it was going to be that sort of book. And because of COVID, I could just go right to so what are we going to do about it? And so that's why I think this moment is so, so important. We could revert back to our old normal, and just keep going. But then we're going to end up in the same place we were. And I think a lot of us are recognizing that place was broken. And so what's next? And so that's really where it comes from.
Thank you so much for this firsthand insight into your book, The First, The Few, The Only. I know it's available on Amazon. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation when we talk about your current offering, Information. I can't wait to talk about that. Community, if you want to hear this broadcast again, you know where to go, www.drnita.com. On the landing page in the middle at the top, click on the button, Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita. In the meantime, remember, I want you to please subscribe, like, and give me some feedback. This show is about you, and whatever information you want to hear about, I want to give it to you. Until the next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.